Welcome to Breaking Embargo. I'm Peter Barnes. That's Ben Habib. Let's get into it. Ben, thank you so much for joining me here at Breaking Embargo. It's a great privilege to have you. I've always been a fan, despite what many people on the internet may think. I actually do quite like you. You know, we've had a few ding dongs in the past, haven't we?
Well, they're only they're ding dongs. They're sort of familial ding dongs because we're
Yeah.
essentially on the same side, aren't we?
Yeah, I think that's the
Yeah,
thing, the right, when we go at each other and it's always done because I think we want our side to be better. We want to improve our side. We're not going at each other because we don't like each other. It's just we have standards and we want to hit those standards. And I think
absolutely.
that's the one thing that the right needs to get better at is actually holding each other accountable for when we get things right or when we get things wrong. And, saying that, maybe that's not how I would have done things.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't see it as a right-left issue. I think I think if you don't mind me being pedantic, I think it's important. I think the real divide in politics is not between right and left. Those are notions that are out of date. The real divide in politics now is: are you a believer in the nation state of the United Kingdom and its self-governance and Parliament being the supreme body in the country, or are you a believer in governance through supranational institutions, international cooperation, international law, domestic quangos with experts and bureaucrats? And I think that's the divide. And I think you and I are basically Democrats, and we want this country to be in an independent, sovereign, prosperous, and proud United Kingdom.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on that. The dividing lines have really changed. That they're kind of old school left and right. I think you're right. I think it is dead now because you can get lots of different types of left wingers. There's lots of different types of right wingers. But you're right. It is that grounding. Do you believe in the right of the UK to govern itself, or are you I suppose the term globalist is what they use, isn't it? That kind of. Do you believe in the kind of the supranational states, which is the more Keir Starmer side of things? Because obviously, for me, he is the embodiment of that idea that the UK can't do it itself. I think that's the real bit. Actually, they don't believe that the UK is capable anymore, and I just don't believe that that's true. I really just don't believe that because I look at these institutions and I just see nothing but incompetence and corruption.
Yeah, and it's been, I think, a part of it, Peter, is a function of having been part of the EU for 40 years. So members of parliament have become basically mouthpieces for EU regulation. They haven't had to actually take responsibility for anything. And the other aspect of it is, in order to gain power, parties have become more and more dictatorial in the way that their party members to behave and toe the line. And so you've got dumbed down members of parliament. So you've got people who aren't capable of thinking and who don't have to think.
Yeah, that's true. I always joke around that we took back control and gave it to the worst possible people. I think that's the worst thing. But it's interesting you bring up the kind of the standard of MPs, because it's always been a thing for me that political parties now, they don't want conviction politicians anymore. They need people just to walk down a corridor and vote in a particular way. And, people blame first past the post for a lot of our kind of electoral problems. For me, it's political parties. You've got to get to grips with the power of parties rather than how we vote people in. Don't get me wrong. First past the post, not great. But, a political party having so much power. Oh, yeah. So my thing with PR is which one? It doesn't really make sense to me saying you want proportional representation because there's so many types. It's like saying you want food for dinner. It's great, but not useful. And, it's always it's always used by a lot of people, I think, by saying because we will never get into power without PR. The minute they get anywhere near it, it's dropped. Keir Starmer's a prime example, and your old side, Reform. They were a big PR advocate. Don't hear much of it now these days, do we?
Well, Farage still does bang on about it a bit, but I mean, I think it's a fundamentally flawed concept, whichever kind of PR you have.
Yeah.
It was one thing I was not in favor of when I was part of Reform. I think that the kind of changes we need in our country require a very strong government, and you can only get strong government through first past the post. You have to have a damn good majority, but you've got to get good people. And,
Yeah.
no point having a majority if it's a bunch of monkeys. You just get nonsense out. So we need good people.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the current government is a prime example of that. Very strong government, and they've not a clue what they're doing. It's absolute chaos. I'm going to say, I think
Yeah,
that's the one thing me and you, Ben, have always been agreed on is the fact that Westminster at the moment, the standards and there's just the organisation is chaos. I
terrible.
mean, how did we fall so far? And rather so fast. That's what gets me. It's not just that it's terrible. It went from, well, this is a bit bad to dumpster fire incredibly quickly.
It has. It's deeply distressing, and it's going to take a while just because of the electoral process. It's going to take a while before we can get proper statesmen into
Mm.
parliament, people who are able to think, able to articulate, and prepared to articulate, who have the guts and courage to actually say what needs to be said and not fear that they're going to be cancelled or have a
Mm.
non-crime hate incident notice served on them or have the Speaker of the House say they can't discuss this, that, and the other. They have to stand up and they've got to thump the table, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right there. We've actually got to have some people with some conviction and some principles, which I don't
Yeah.
think we've had in a very long time. I don't think we've had them
No,
since I was alive, if I'm being honest.
no,
But
come on, we did. How old are you? You
I'm
weren't born.
34.
Oh my God, see, maybe
Yeah.
not.
This is what Westminster does to you. Like, just so everybody knows, I was quite fresh faced at one point. I'm not always
Yeah.
like this. This is the Brexit years. This is what I say Brexit did to people.
You just missed Maggie then, did you? You
Yes, I
just
did.
missed
Yeah.
Maggie. Yeah.
Yeah, I was 91
Yeah.
when I was born. So I
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
missed, being
Yeah.
a child of Thatcher. But no, unfortunately, I suppose I'm classed really as a child of Blair, I suppose, coming up through the Blair
Which is
years.
terrible. Awful.
I know. Tell me
Yeah.
about it. But
Yeah.
no, but it's interesting, really, that, we talk about conviction because, if there's one person at the moment, I think, who has got conviction, whether rightly or wrongly, is our good friend Rupert Lowe.
Yeah.
What happened to him in terms of reform and these accusations and everything that was kind of like it was kind of a groundswell, like a perfect storm to create a person who I think is right on a lot of the issues. I think Rupert is right on what we need and the levels of what we need, but the way that he was treated, I thought, was abhorrent, and I thought the way you were treated, Ben, and many others by reform was just not right. It just wasn't right. The amount of effort and dedication you put in, I don't think was recognized, and I don't think it was right. And I think a lot of people see that now, that maybe the shine is starting to knock off Nigel and starting to disappear from reform. Do you think they've still got the confidence of the movement that they're kind of controlling?
Well, the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating. There's 4 years to go for the general election. And I mean, my issue with reform is not the way that it treated me particularly.
Mm.
I've got a real issue with the way they treated Rupert Lowe,
Yeah.
because I think making vexatious complaints to the police and allegations of bullying when it's patently not correct, that is unacceptable. With me, they were relatively benign. I got sacked. I didn't get a word of thanks, but no one ever does. In reform, I mean, no one ever does. But there've been dozens and dozens of people. You'd be surprised, or maybe won't be surprised to hear, Peter, who've suffered the same fate as Rupert,
Mm.
thrown out of the party and then vilified on the
Yeah.
way out. And I don't think you would be able to point to one individual who has left reform and who, on his way out of reform, has had Farage say, "What a brilliant job he did. We're so grateful for him having been in the party."
Mm.
If you can find me an example of that, I'd be really impressed. But
Yeah.
I think that the problem with reform, I don't want to talk too much about
No.
reform because,
No.
frankly, Farage is boring.
Mm.
But the problem with reform is that it's got no checks and balances in place. It's got no constitution other than the fact that Farage is its leader,
Mm.
and it's now controlled effectively by Yusuf and him in joint venture. So you can't count that as a proper political force. And if they treat people the way they are, and if they continue to, they're doing exactly the same thing with MPs that you and I were just discussing. They're getting basic dross
Yeah.
that would just follow their line. I mean, without wishing to be unduly disparaging about Sarah Potchin, but she is really not impressive.
Mm.
And she was welcoming illegal migrants into her constituency of Cheshire East. She was attending transgender events. she spoke in favour of the withdrawal of the winter fuel allowance, which may be a perfectly valid view, but then she pivoted on it when she was standing for reform. She was thrown out of the Conservatives. She was thrown out of Labour Independent. And that was their MP candidate for Runcorn and Helsby, And she just voted in favour of the assisted dying bill, which you and I may debate, but I think it's an abhorrent bill. Yeah. Anyway,
that's interesting actually, because that never really came up. Like the fact that she's not the typical reform archetype that you would imagine that they would go for. That they are just. Do you think they're just kind of picking like not really anybody, but they just need a face? And they're relying on the brand of reform rather than the individuals to kind of carry it through with the electorate.
Yeah, they just want someone who hasn't posted anything too racy on social media in the past and who looks the part and then will do what Farage tells them to do. And that's Sarah Potchin.
That's terrible, really, when you think about it, because like you said, they talk about the uni party quite a lot. And I'm like, you're just as bad, if not worse, in my opinion.
That's what they're becoming. No, Peter, you're spot on. That's what they're becoming.
Yeah, it is. They really are. It's the hypocrisy of the nature that it really is at the heart of that party that I just find staggering, and it annoys me no end. Like we're saying, the other people on the right don't call them out for it. We say like, this is our only chance. Like, you've got to back the party. It's like, no. You don't win by playing the same game. You don't change politics by being the same. And it infuriates me no end. And the minute that you bring that up, you say like, oh, you're being disrespectful. You're not being loyal. I was like, no, you're not doing the right thing. And that it's never called out enough. Not at all. But I was going to say, like, we're on a kind of nuts and bolts level, on a kind of like day one, if you were ever to get into number 10 and have that kind of power, Ben, what would be your top priority thing? Obviously, I imagine it would be the boats, but on day one, what would be the driving thing that you would do first?
So for me, it's all about structure. It's going to sound really nerdy and boring, but I think one of the reasons reform isn't going to work because it doesn't have a constitution. A proper constitution for the party. And one of the reasons I think we're falling apart as a country is because our unwritten constitution we had a perfectly good constitution, but it's been hijacked over the last 30 years through the passing of legislation, which has been deeply damaging to the country, as well as the signing up to international treaties, supranational institutions and so on, like we just discussed, and the creation of lots of domestic quangos. And I think the first priority for any incoming government, up right at the top, has got to be the repealing of all these laws, arrangements that have so neutered our ability to govern ourselves. We've got to go back to some time around when you were born, I think, from a constitutional perspective. And of course, you've got to do other things while you do that. But I think that's got to be one of the top priorities.
Yeah, for me, the over-regulation and the idea that you can legislate for everything has to stop. It's got to stop. We've got laws in this country that are to apply to another law, that applies to another law, that applies to another thing.
Absolutely.
It's absolutely infuriating. And it is the reason that we will not get growth is that. It's nothing to do with anything, like all this other stuff. It is literally the fact that companies have to traverse this kind of red tape world that should not exist. And until we get rid of that, everything else really is, like you say, it's not really that it's not important, but it is the structure and the framework that has to change in this country.
It's really critical. Priority. I thought it was really interesting that the answer to the demand for free speech was a law that promotes free speech. Actually, no one thought, in fact, what we always did have free speech. What we have to do is repeal the laws that have prevented it. And they just put layer and layer and layer and layer on top of a complete bloody mess, basically.
Oh, couldn't agree more. But also, I make this point with people who go on about the ECHR and saying that one thing we have to also do is change the culture. So for example, we could repeal the ECHR, but I think the judges will find another way, that these people will find another bit of law, another way to keep people in. We have to have a kind of root and branch change of the culture of this country that actually, we should be encouraging people to be entrepreneurs, to take the risk. We should be encouraging people to kind of not be so kind of protective of themselves and actually kind of go out there and try things. And I think that has to really, really be a number one priority.
I completely agree. We need two things, I think, on the culture: the reversal of the long march through the institutions, which these globalists have managed to so successfully achieve. So we need to fire lots of people, basically. And then this precautionary principle, this idea that the state can put its protective blanket around you, that you will always be looked after, indeed, that you have an entitlement to be protected by the state. That culture has to change. We've got to reinstill the benefits and the necessity and the benefits of taking risks. We've got to create aspiration. We've got to give people the tools with which they can go out and better their lives rather than trying to better their lives for them. If you're with me, and we can never get rid of the poor or the middle class or the very rich. But what you can do is give people the tools necessary to improve their own lot and transition through the not class system, but through the economic pyramid, if you like.
Yeah. No, definitely. And and it's always been my thing for me is whatever happened to the idea of just try and fix it yourself? Why is it always the government's responsibility now to do every single aspect for you? It never used to be like that. And, with the over reliance and the idea of that every kind of major or even just minor little panic, everybody turns to the government and says, well, what are you going to do about it? And 9 times out of 10, why don't we remember the old Ronald Reagan quote of I'm from the government and I'm here to help are terrifying words, not words of comfort. This idea that Whitehall, of all places, knows how to run anything has never made sense to me.
No, I agree. 100%.
It makes me laugh that HS2, for example, is studied in Chinese universities of how not to run a government project. It's really? Actually studied about how not to do something. And yet we seem to still have, and it's interesting you bring that up, is firing people, because we don't do that in this country anymore.
No.
Why is nobody ever held accountable? Where is the accountability for bad work? And particularly in our public sector. And I look at people like Tim Davie, for example, at the BBC. How has he got a job? How?
Yeah.
It's disaster after catastrophe after mismanagement. In the private sector, you wouldn't just be fired. You'd never work in the industry again if you were this bad. So, for me, Ben, how would you really kind of hire to raise those standards? Do you think it is a matter of, giving pink slips out and boxes on desks and saying, see you later?
I think it is. I mean, you've got to get a cohort of MPs who really understand how to run things. We need to improve the quality of MP. You've got to have ministers and cabinet ministers who understand human nature, have run organizations, and can challenge those beneath them and identify within minutes of meeting people whether or not they're worth keeping, and then having the courage to terminate. And if they don't have the laws behind them enabling them to terminate because there's some protective law in place that prohibits it, then you change the law. And, if you got first past the post should produce a good majority, hopefully, and then you can do what you want. And we've got to have that kind of ability. But you look across, without wishing to repeat myself too much, but you look across Westminster and you don't see anyone in there who's got that caliber.
Well, we have
not
a
many.
cabinet
There are a few, but not many. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a cabinet where none of them have ever worked really in the private sector.
No. Jonathan Reynolds, who's business secretary, claimed to be a lawyer. He wasn't.
Oh, God.
Rachel Reeves, who's chancellor, claims to
be an economist.
She's not.
Yeah. I mean, it just seemed to me that that whole identifying thing they took a little bit too seriously. And if you identify as a lawyer, then you apparently are one. If you identify as an economist, then you are one. They did really run a little bit too far down the road with that one, if you think about it.
Yeah.
But no, it just seems to me that kind of cutthroat, but not cutthroat in a kind of nasty way, but in a cutthroat in a kind of, this is business, this is government, this is serious stuff. It doesn't seem to be there anymore. And it's not just the Labour Party. The Liberal Democrats, you've got Sir Ed Davey running around doing roly-polies, believing he could be Prime Minister. And
it's just ridiculous, isn't it?
Oh,
absolutely absurd.
I also find it embarrassing. I find it genuinely embarrassing that the party of Gladstone, the party of great liberal reformers, great politicians, has been reduced to a man thinking he's on Takeshi's Castle or something like that. I don't understand how far and how quickly they fell and how nobody seems to care in the Lib Dems that that's what they're seen as.
I've seen it. I've said it to a few people, politically astute people, and they said, "Oh no, he's very clever because he's avoiding having to face any questions." Well, if that's politically astute, then we're screwed, aren't we?
Yeah.
Forgive my language, but we are.
Yeah, exactly. Questions aren't bad. We have to get out of the mentality, and I think the right is dangerously creeping down this way, that any kind of question is a criticism. You should welcome questions as a politician. You should welcome scrutiny. And if you keep running away from it, you're not changing things. That is fundamentally, you're not changing things, because you should be able to defend what you're doing, or be able to criticize something else. If you're not willing to go up in front of a journalist or up in front of an unfriendly media outlet, whoever it may be, you're literally letting the country down, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're not, if you yourself are not challenged, then you won't have the opportunity yourself to develop your own thinking. Yes. You have to be challenged and defend your position. And in the pursuit of defending your position, you might actually reveal something to yourself. Introspection is a really important part of, getting to grips with one's own political philosophy. And I think a lot of people go out there and they think there's something and they say things and they haven't really thought them through. And there's a particular individual who immediately comes to mind.
No comment. Ironically. But that is a real problem, I think. And this kind of, I always used to say the left was the worst for it, but I think the right is becoming just as bad. That kind of, I'm not listening to that person because they said this that one time. This false dichotomy of you have to like everything about a person or dislike everything about a person. It's the noose around our necks if we're not careful.
I agree. I couldn't care what someone said on Twitter, frankly, 5 years ago. If it wasn't arrestable, then fine, move on.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. It is, we're in a very perilous time, but I think we're at a time of great opportunity as well. I really do feel that sense of this is the kind of make or break moment where we could really change a lot of things in this country for the good, but also the change could come and it could be for the bad. And I really hope that, people in Parliament and in these quangos and everything else really understand that. Do you think they feel that?
Well, I don't think they do feel it. I think that if they felt it, they'd react to it, wouldn't they? I mean, Starmer paid lip service to reacting to the immigration issues last week. And then a couple of days later, he took the borders down for the European Union.
I mean, like, you talk about
classic example. No joined thinking. No joined up thinking is the killer of this country. And I've said this from day one. The idea that things just happen in little silos is nonsense. But anyway, Ben, I've taken up far too much of your time. You're far too busy to sit talking to me. So thank you again. It's been absolutely brilliant for you to come on and join us. I'll leave all Ben's details below and do join us next time.